42-year-old man was killed by police yesterday after officials say he tried to break into an FBI field office in Cincinnati, Ohio. After attempting to breach the office and exchanging gunfire with officers around 9 a.m., Ricky Schiffer was chased and cornered in a nearby cornfield where he was eventually shot and killed in the late afternoon, ending hours of failed negotiations. Police say Schiffer was wearing body armor and armed with both an AR-15 style rifle and a nail gun.
NBC News has confirmed that Schiffer was present at the Capitol during the January 6th riots, and Truth Social posts by Schiffer say that he wanted a, quote, war after the raid on Mar-a-Lago. In the days leading up to his death, Schiffer encouraged his followers to arm themselves and, quote, shoot the FBI on sight. And Emily, this is, people predicted that this would be the result of some of the rhetoric in response to the raid on Mar-a-Lago. I'm trying to imagine what happened, if something like this happened. So if you remember back in, I forget what year it happened, but somebody who had posted a bunch of things that made them, sympathetic to Black Lives Matter. They traveled up to New York City and, my memory is, killed 2 police officers. I forget exactly what year that was. People can Google that up, and it really dampened the movement. It really pushed, it really gave people a lot of second thoughts about some of the rhetoric, and said, well, this has gone way too far. This is absolutely not what we mean. And I'm wondering, how this is going to be, received on the right.
Honestly, I think we're stuck in a pattern where this is all going to be a feature of our politics. And so you traveled up to New York, or I'm thinking of the Dallas shooting. Do you remember the Dallas shooting?
There was that one too. Yeah.
Yeah, and it did seem like for a while there was a lull in the rhetoric, and then 2020 comes and it's really roaring back. And since then, I feel like there's been little introspection on the part of the media or the left. And that's not to say, of course, some of this has died down and there is another lull, I think, in the fervor. But I still think there's been little introspection, and there's less introspection. I'm not just talking about BLM. I'm talking about both sides here. Less introspection about inflammatory rhetoric, because increasingly the beast has already been fed. And we kind of talked about this in my radar a little bit, to the point where now we have a whole class of powerful people who actually buy into a lot of this and aren't cynically just feeding the beast. They're actually they really believe it. And on top of that, I think the appetite, because the conditioning has been so strong for so many years, the appetite is there anyway. And so how do you sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube at that point? I just don't see it happening. I don't see it happening I don't think Republicans would do it when it comes to talking about stolen election, although I do think Republicans talk less about the election allegedly being stolen. It was not stolen. They talk more about it being rigged now. I do think that's a meaningful distinction. If you're talking about Mark Zuckerberg pouring tons of money into races in different parts that tended to be, or not tended to be, were clearly favorable to Democrats, or regions that were clearly favorable to Democrats, a totally different conversation. I do think you've seen a shift from, in some corners, not all corners, but I do think you've seen a shift from that to that. But in general, I just think the rhetoric, the tendency of the rhetoric is just to go up and up and up. And it doesn't matter if the party happens to be Republicans or Democrats.
And I think somewhat separately, this also exposes some of the way that this unfolds, exposes some of the absurdity behind some of the rhetoric around the Second Amendment, because you hear a lot of people saying that the Second Amendment is there to preserve liberty, to give people, an armed people the ability to maintain their own freedom, and it just flies in the face of. Yes, there are 300 plus million armed, guns circulating among the private population here in the United States, but it's no match for the federal government. Like you're not going to, this guy ended up getting killed in a cornfield. Even a handful of armed people. Like you're not going to use terrorism to overthrow the federal government. It's just not going to happen. And the kind of propagandists affiliated with the NRA and some of the more extreme elements of that movement who suggest to people, I think, are kind of Pied Pipering people to their deaths, because that's where this is going to lead. You're not gonna occupy an FBI field office in Ohio. It's just not going to happen.
Certainly you're not, although I think a lot of that rhetoric is more if you're individually, and this is why Vice reported on the growth of a black pro-gun organization. This is why I do think there's a serious argument to be made that as an individual, when you're targeted and you're on the defense, I think more of that rhetoric is aimed at that sort of side of the argument, that like when as an individual you're targeted by law enforcement unjustly, you have your Second Amendment right to defend yourself. But there are certainly, and there have been, I mean, in the 90s and since the 90s, there have absolutely been sort of fringe activist militia type movements that have suggested they need to have firearms to outgun the feds, which is basically, as you say, Ryan, basically impossible. Although being on the right, I don't really know anybody outside fringe groups who really believes that, but there certainly are people on the fringes who do.
Right, and it always ends in tears and in blood, like Ruby Ridge, Waco, like them being armed, like did not stop the federal government. Anyway, that's a separate question. But these are scary times that we're entering into. And it seemed like Merrick Garland's public statement yesterday was not necessarily a response to this particular incident, but to a lot of not just kind of political challenges being made to the FBI, but he said that there were enormous numbers of threats to FBI agents around the country. So I think you're right. This is going to be a part of our politics going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to recognize that it's happening to police departments, it's happening to the FBI, and it's just going to be, I feel like, sadly, Ryan, you and I are going to have conversations like where we do blocks on things like this almost weekly, probably into the future, because I just think it's going to become a feature, that violence, in a way that it hasn't, or on a scale that it hasn't in the past, political violence is going to become a feature, a bigger feature of our sort of political landscape than it has been. People like to talk about 1968. I think we thankfully haven't had the level of assassinations that we saw in the 60s. But I do feel like in terms of the heated rhetoric and the heated demonstrations, protests, riots, we've sort of cruised past that.
And I'm curious, from your perspective, how long can kind of the more extreme Republican right maintain this weird contradiction where you have absolute unquestioning vocal support for local police, but then absolute unquestioning kind of criticism of the FBI. Marjorie Taylor Greene kind of using the phrase defund, being the kind of emblematic response to that. At what point is that just too much of a contradiction to maintain?
Well, did you see the clip from Fox and Friends yesterday where Steve Doocy pressed Steve Scalise and said, "What happened to back the blue?" He asked Steve Scalise, "What happened to back the blue?" And Steve Scalise, I think, had a pretty decent answer to that question. He said, the Republican Party is strong supporters of law enforcement, but the FBI obviously has demonstrated this intolerable pattern of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So is it an important distinction? Yes. Is it politically easy from a messaging perspective? I don't know if it's that difficult, but it's definitely, you're splitting hairs. And I think the question, Ryan, to your point, is going to be, where are those incentives in terms of winning voters? Especially, we know both parties right now are battling hard for suburban voters, for educated suburban women. What is the incentive? What incentives are there for how they talk about law enforcement? And that, to me, is probably one of the things that could cause a shift or could cause a dampening in the rhetoric. But I don't know. It's hard to imagine going forward. It's just tough to say.
Yeah, because Republicans ran a ton of their House campaigns just around the defund the police, trying to yoke defund the police around every kind of swing district Democrat, and that probably is made much more difficult if you're just steadily undermining the federal police. But maybe not. I mean, maybe people can hold both of these thoughts and tension in their heads indefinitely, but it seems hard to me to do that.
Yeah, that's a super interesting trend to watch for, definitely in this midterm cycle, maybe in the presidential cycle too. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that one. And we'll have more Rising
for sure
right after this.